Charles Beare has, as always, been inspirational. His knowledge and passion for Venetian instruments is legendary. He must take credit for the identification and preservation of many of the most important instruments of our era. A book on his research into Venetian stringed instruments has been in the planning for very many years, and it is rumoured that this eagerly waited publication might be near to be released. So please now give your warmest welcome to an exceptional man. Welcome to the stage. He is the finest authority on fine antiques instruments of the violin family in the world. He's him who brings a huge amount of kudos to instrument dealing, instrument research in this country. Charles Beare, please take the stage. Thank you.
I must say what a pleasure it is to be back here again. The last time I came here for a similar evening, Stephen Isserlis warned me that he was digging out all the nasty stories about me and the funny ones that he could possibly find. So in response to that, I dug up whatever I could find about him. And then he stood here and made an overwhelmingly kind speech. And I hadn't prepared anything. So this time I've done a little bit better and written a few things down. Venice is indeed a love of everybody who's been there, I think, and it did have, in the 18th century, a sort of almost a domination. They went on way beyond the Cremonese did for another 50 years. And I've written a few notes, and I hope I can read them all in 5 minutes flat, because what we really want to hear is some music. People, surprisingly, when one looks at the history of the cello in Venice, and for that matter the violin and viola as well, there is almost a complete blank until about 1680. There were plenty of instruments being made in the city, not just lutes and other plucked instruments, but bowed ones of varying sizes as well. However, in Venice, the bowed instruments divided into two basic types, the viols with their flat backs and the liras that were mostly played on the shoulder, and therefore does not concern us this evening. Of these, there are perhaps 50 survivors in all from Venice. Of course, in Cremona at the same period, the violin, viola and cello not only flourished, but were virtually perfected by Andrea Amati, who died in 1577, followed by later members of his family until into the 18th century. For some reason, their work had no appeal in Venice, not even after the great Cremonese-born Claudio Monteverdi was appointed to be in charge of the music at San Marco from 1613 until his death in 1643. They just didn't want to know about the violin family. I can't tell you why, but it was bound to be pride of some sort, I always feel. But if you were Venetian and you absolutely had to get a violin, you sent for one in Cremona because they didn't make them. At any rate, what Venice was proud of between 1500 and about 1650 was its lutes, guitars, and other related plucked instruments. But then in the following decades, that great market weakened, and in its place came at last an ever-increasing demand in Venice for violins and cellos, and occasionally, somebody here will be relieved, violas. Not very many. One of several lute and guitar makers who tried to earn a living making bowed instruments was Martin Kaiser, his family came from the Alps, and as did a lot of Venetian makers of plucked instruments. Martin Kaiser, who after a moderate cello in 1679 made a much better violin 6 years later. It was he who in 1685 took on Matthias Gofriller, that's Gfriller, who had been born in Brixen, Bressanone, in the Alps in 1659. Next year, he married 19-year-old Maria Laura Kaiser, soon took the shop over, and then made his wonderful instruments without any competition for the next 20 years. Rich or poor, tall or short, male or female, anyone wanting a cello or a violin in Venice would knock on Gofriller's door until about 1710. He was indeed the true father of Venetian violin making and only died in 1742. And if I'm right, we're going to be hearing two this evening? Just the one, which used to be the instrument of Pablo Casals. Domenico Montagnana, born in 1686 in Lendinara, southwest of Venice, grew up as a shoemaker and came to the city with his family in 1699. He was able to set up his violin shop in 1712, and my present thinking, which isn't quite 100% complete, is that he probably took on another well-known violin maker who was also originally a shoemaker, called Francesco Gabetti. And there he was perhaps even taught by Gabetti, Montagnana was. Francesco had been a pupil of Gofriller's until 2 or 3 years before. In 1717, Montagnana married Caterina Berti, a Venetian lady who bore 6 daughters, but was seriously paralyzed, unable to move either her arms or her legs when she died. The first daughter died at the age of 14, but the other 5 all survived and outlived both of their parents. Domenico himself died in 1750, and I think he's very highly regarded and for very, very good reasons. Santo Seraphin was born in Udine in 1699 and was also in Venice for several years before he became a violin maker, a liutaio. He had his own shop by 1733, but in 1745 he resigned from it. That was a great mystery for a time, but from then on we now know that he seems to have sold his instruments in Montagnana's shop in the same short street, as did his nephew Giorgio Serafin, who took the place over in the end. Montagnana died in 1750, and at that point Giorgio Serafin not only contracted to run the business, but as part of the deal married the late Domenico's daughter Antonia. Giorgio was incidentally the only Venetian liutaio who was actually born in the city. All the others came from elsewhere. The 2 Seraphins, they died in successive years, Giorgio in 1775, and Santo, who we're going to hear some nice notes from this evening, I hope, in 1776, the next year. I was asked to comment on the tone that players and listeners can expect from Venetian cellos. This is a question that is not at all easy to answer, but it will be very interesting to be able to compare the ones that are here. I suppose one could generalize better if all the performers were using the same strings. But in my experience of cellists who want to try an unfamiliar instrument, their first words are as often as not going to be something like, "How can you possibly expect me to play on it with these awful strings?" They're very expensive, and everybody likes different ones. What I can say, perhaps, is that in general, my personal experience has been that from a fine Venetian cello in about the same value range as a Cremonese, the Venetian will tend to have a more edgy power to its tone when played forte, and the Cremonese may be less loud, but have a bit more warmth when heard from a distance. Both tend to carry equally well to the back of the hall. Given that so many of these instruments have been altered in size, and often extensively restored in one way or another, the question isn't really a fair one. And if 2 cellos are played in one room and then in a hall, the one you preferred in the room might not be the one of the 2 that you preferred in the hall. I do find that quite often violinists have a preference either for a Stradivari or a Guarneri del Gesù. And it's true that top cellists feel the same way about Stradivari's and Montagnana's. In the good old days, great cellists sometimes owned one of each, but that is not quite so simple anymore. That's all I have to say, and it's going to be a wonderful evening, and I'm going to take my seat and enjoy it too.